Okay, we are ready to start. Welcome everyone to this evening's lecture. The lecture is by Hanna Tervanotko. She is born in Finland. You are, aren't you?
Yes,
you are born, yeah. But then has studied and spent time in many countries since then. Currently, she is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Helsinki, and she's part of a Center of Excellence project at the Academy, funded by the Academy of Finland. Divining by Intuition, a comparative study of Jewish and Greek prophets in the Persian Hellenistic eras, is her personal project. In Finland, they have these very large umbrella projects and researchers who have kind of individual projects underneath that umbrella. She's also associated with the Department of Biblical Studies at Leuven University. And I would also, invite you to present that you are also on your way elsewhere at this moment. She has a doctorate in theology from the University of Helsinki from 2013. She is also she's also a doctor of a PhD from Jewish Studies, University of Vienna. The first one was not the Doctor of Theology, it was the master's degree in theology, and then the second one was the PhD in Department of Jewish Studies at the University of Vienna. She has worked extensively on women and female figures in ancient Jewish texts, and also prophecy and divination. And I guess that we will get a little bit of both tonight, but the title you have seen already. I will just give the floor over to you.
First of all, thank you very much for your introduction and kind of presentation, and thank you all for coming. For someone who comes from Finland, it's always impressive when the weather is so warm and people still find the strength to work or come to events even at this late time. Thank you all for coming. You are right. I think I won't be talking so much about female figures, but rather just touching the topic a little bit, but this is more related to my more recent work. And I don't know if you heard already that my background is in theology and moreover in the biblical and ancient Jewish texts, so Greek oracles is a new field for me. So I'm open for your feedback also on that. Thank you again. Recently, scholars have changed their views concerning the revelation during the Second Temple era. Previously, it was held that the direct revelation, which in the Hebrew Bible was carried out by the prophets, ended with Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Sorry, I'll just put the timing on so I know where I am. So that the prophecy ended with these last prophets of the Hebrew Bible, but now there's a growing scholarly consensus that the prophecy did not actually end, but rather the modes took different modes in the post-exilic era. One way to consult the divine will was through a study of existing prophetic oracles. Encoding the hidden knowledge embedded in the texts could reveal the divine will concerning future events. Whereas it is held that texts were thus some kind of a Loki of revelation during the Second Temple era, many aspects of this turn remain unclear to us. In particular, the question, who were the people that interpreted the existing oracles, calls for further study. In this paper tonight, I will address the divinatory use of the Jewish prophetic texts from a comparative perspective, and analyzed textual divination together with the references to individuals that interpreted oracles preserved in written form in the ancient Greek context. The purpose of this study is to examine whether such analysis can help us to build a more comprehensive picture on the transmitters of these Jewish oracles as well. Furthermore, I want to ask whether comparative readings of our sources illuminates new aspects of both corpora, such that would not be as easily seen if we looked at both of them in isolation. About the structure of my paper, first I will define some methodological starting points. Next I will be looking at what we know about the figures who interpreted the oracles in the Jewish and the Greek corpora. Finally, I will compare the two corpora with each other and draw some conclusions. Significantly, I want to highlight, I do not assume that the Greek texts provide analogous examples for the divinatory use of the texts or the interpreters of the Jewish ones. But rather my aim is to argue they provide new and additional support for this emerging theory that the means to access the divine will shifted during the late Second Temple era. Namely, it seems that the interpreters of the Jewish and Greek texts operated, at least partially, in similar ways in their shared ancient Eastern Mediterranean cultural contexts. Before moving further with my text analysis, it's essential to define some of those methodological starting points that pertain to my understanding of the three components I'm dealing with in this paper: the prophets, interpreters, and collections. By prophets, I mean individuals that intermediate between the divine and human spheres via a cognitive experience, such as a vision or an audition, through which they encounter a divine revelation and later they disclose it to their audience. Often such figures are referred to as Navi in the Jewish and prophetes in the Greek literature. Various written oracles were attributed to such prophetic figures in antiquity. But even more than the prophets themselves, I'm interested in those characters who possessed and performed the written form of their oracles. In ancient Jewish texts, there is no specific term that would presuppose that interpretation of oracles was a professional task. Meanwhile, the Greek texts often refer to individuals whose job was to interpret already existing prophetic words. Accordingly, the title Chresmologos derives from the two Greek words, the verb charao, which meaning proclaim or to declare, and logos, that designates word. While they were predominantly connected with ancient Greece, so this Chresmologos, it's important to note that a Jewish writer, Philo of Alexandria, uses this term in his special laws. And I quote, "Just so though some oracle mongers may ply their false art of divination, mask under the specious name of prophecy, and pump off their ecstatic utterances upon the Godhead, they will easily be detected." This quote from Philo implies that the term was not exclusively used in ancient Greece, but also in the broader Greco-Roman context. Moreover, at least some Jewish authors were familiar with it. Thirdly, I consider the oracle collections. Significantly, the term oracle or prophetic collection do not appear in the texts themselves, but the Jewish texts refer to the prophetic words, davarim, and in the Greek text, such utterances are referred to as logoi. When the formation of such texts is addressed, scholars have often assumed two different phases of the word. So when we talk about the prophecy, it's often assumed that there's an oral stage that took historically place, and the textualization would follow that. Already this theory assumes that the oracles reflect, therefore, historical realities, that this orality took place. I would like to emphasize that in my study I do not assume such a scenario. Rather, my my main aim is to focus merely on the use of the written texts. Moreover, while I acknowledge that some of the texts were used for a divinatory purpose, in the Jewish context especially the words of Moses, or the Pentateuch, in this study I limit my discussion to those collections that are attributed to prophets for the sake of convenience. Finally, it should be noted that any concept of canon during the period addressed today is hypothetical. Therefore, it's unimportant to determine whether the oracles enjoyed any canonical status. In short, the use of both Jewish and Greek texts as means to access revelation indicates that they were used for divinatory purposes in their own contexts. Now I turn to look at the Jewish text. In the Hebrew Bible, prophets tend to answer inquiries concerning the divine will orally. Moreover, on those occasions where writing is somehow implied, so it's for instance an instance where a prophet sends the message or the prophet's word is brought to the king, the texts do not tell the reader who wrote the oracles down. Recently, various scholars have pointed out the marginal evidence the Hebrew Bible preserves concerning the recording of oracles. Those prophets that are referred to in our preserved texts, they only seldom write. Only Jeremiah, Daniel, Elijah, and Isaiah write down revelatory messages. Yet the literacy of especially Elijah and Isaiah remains questionable because the literary contexts do not reveal whether it's the prophets themselves who write their messages or if their messages are memorized by someone else. For instance, in this passage, Isaiah, son of Amos, sent to Hezekiah, so he sends the word, but we do not know who is the author, who has written it down. While the identity of the agents who write down their oracles remains open, we know from other texts, and especially from prophet Jeremiah, that sometimes prophets could dictate the message to a scribe whose task was to memorize it in writing. The text suggests that some of Jeremiah's prophecies are recorded by Baruch, Jeremiah's scribe, who even reads them in the temple. So here, people there from then in hearing the people, Baruch read the words of Jeremiah from the scroll in the house of Lord, and that gives even a very specific location where the reading took place. It has been accepted for long that prophets themselves did not collect their oracles, and the identity of the people who recorded them remains debated. Until recently, it's been held that it was the disciples of the prophets who collected the oracles and wrote them down. But I want to say that I'm not fully convinced by this scenario, because the biblical passage that refer to the disciples of prophets, so prophets could have followers or disciples as we want to call them, but these passages do not mention any scribal activities. Therefore, to me, this scenario sounds a little bit anachronistic, and I wonder to what extent the Christian idea of Jesus' words that were memorized by his disciples has influenced it. I will return to the possibilities of who wrote the prophecies down later. Despite the dominant oral form of prophecy and the uncertain identity of the compilers of the written oracles, writing as a concept is often referred to in oracles, which frequently mention how God commands the prophet to write down the message. Because of its frequency, the command to write seems to be important for the authors of the texts, and it may serve particular purposes. Possibly such a command aimed at authorizing these collections when the oracle collections circulated later. Additionally, the command to write that was attributed to God invoked the divine origin of the oracles. Hindi Naiman has discussed the testimonial role of writing, which made it more valuable than just a complement to oral discourses between God and Israel. Naiman suggests that already the composers themselves recognized what they were doing as a prophetic activity. The cautious prophetic function of the texts themselves is particularly visible in those passages of the oracles that preserve the command to write them down. The highlighted process of preserving the oracle seems to point to the future. Therefore, when oracles were being revised and recorded, their later use was somehow already assumed. Moreover, one should emphasize that despite their seeming spontaneity, with the prophetic word appearing in a specific moment, the oracles are often future-oriented and sometimes even contain a notion that they will be confirmed only later in the future. For instance, Isaiah 38 anticipate the later use of an oracle. I quote, "Go now, write it before them on a tablet and inscribe it in a book, so that it may be for the time to come as a witness forever." Further, Habakkuk 2 assumes that the word will be fulfilled only later in the future. I quote, "Then the Lord answered me and said, write the vision, make it plain on tablets, so that the runner may read it. For there is still a vision for the appointed time. It speaks of the end and does not lie. If it seems to tarry, wait for it. It will surely come. It will not delay." In these passages, writing form ensures the later consultation of the text. Finally, perhaps nowhere in the Hebrew Bible is the revelation through text as evident as in Jeremiah. The prophet sends letters containing the words that were revealed to him. All these literary contexts expect that the oracles will be later read and that their fulfillment will also take place in the future. After having suggested that already some oracle collections of the Hebrew Bible assume their later use, I will now turn to other references that will further illuminate this, and especially the interpretive use of the text. Significantly, some narrative passages of the Hebrew Bible hint that prophetic collections were already known to the scribes in the late Second Temple era. For instance, the book of Daniel narrates its protagonist's consulting writings, mentioning in particular Jeremiah in Daniel 9. In the first year of Darius, son of Ahasuerus, by birth needy, who became king over the realm of the Chaldeans, in the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, perceived in the books of the number of the years that, according to the word of the Lord to the prophet Jeremiah, must be fulfilled for the devastation of Jerusalem, namely 70 years. Despite the vagueness of this reference, the explicit reference to the books, so it mentions books, Sepharim, indicates that the author of this passage had in mind somehow a written oracle, perhaps Jeremiah 25:11, which refers to 70 years. Therefore, Daniel would have consulted a scroll, a material object, in which it was recorded. Significantly, Daniel chooses to consult a text instead of a prophet of his own time. His independent consultation of Jeremiah's written oracle presumably led him to a better understanding of his own contemporary era. Other ancient Jewish texts also bear witness to the prophetic collections and their use in a variety of ways. The obvious example is the Pesharim, the earliest known works of biblical interpretation found in the Qumran collection of manuscripts, which feature a systematic commentary structure. These Pesharim contain a biblical citation followed by a formulaic phrase that includes the word pesher, which is this, the interpretation. So there is the biblical passage, and then it says like interpretation of this concerns, and then comes the interpretation that applies to the author's own historical context. The language of the Pesharim suggests that the contemporary interpretation may have been a result of some kind of revelatory situation. Apart from the structure of the text, the revelatory nature of Pesharim also finds support in the literature of ancient Near East. The Hebrew word pesher is functionally equivalent to an Akkadian term pishru, which is a part of a technical vocabulary of scholarly divination. Further, the contents of these commentary texts suggest revelatory events. For instance, Pesher Habakkuk states, God told, and I'm looking at here the latter part, so this is again the interpretation, so the biblical passage, it's interpretation, and then comes the contextualization. God told Habakkuk to write down things that are going to come upon the last generation, but the fulfillment of the end of the time he did not make known to him. In other words, God gave Habakkuk the revelation, but not its interpretation. According to the Pesher's author, someone other but Habakkuk had to explain it. The meaning of the passage came from God, and thus also that was a divine revelation. Furthermore, it's been pointed out that the Pesharim should be seen as scholarly literature, and that the commentary nature actually complements the earlier divine revelation. Systematic structure and use of scribal resources align the Pesharim with the works of scholarship across the Hellenistic Roman world. This seems to be a point worth of considering. Whereas science and divination in our own time belong to two opposite realms, one based on evidence and the other one based on belief, in ancient world this was not the case. Divination was a set of careful methods that one had to master in order to inquire the divine will and interpret it correctly. Therefore, one might think that the ancient writer was inspired by an already existing prophetic word, the author of Pesher Habakkuk, and this revelation evoked a new interpretation. The commentary structure of the Pesher does not indicate it was merely a scholarly product. It could at the same time be a result of revelatory experience, or at least the passage studied above reflects such a possibility. While this process of interpretation may seem relatively clear-cut, the fundamental problem of it is exactly what I'm talking about today, the lack of explicit evidence that would demonstrate the existence of this kind of interpretation. So even if we can imagine this interpretation taking place, the text themselves does not witness directly to the process of transmitting and interpreting it. So there is no third person narrative that would say that this is how the text was interpreted. Pesher Habakkuk talks about revelation, but the narrative section does not contain any explicit references to it. Leaving the question concerning the historicity open, how did it happen, one can still reflect on the image of the interpreter that the text transmits. On the one hand, the text proposed that a person dealing with existing oracles is learned, like Daniel, an individual who operates in the court and is referred to as a wise person, as Daniel is in the book of Daniel. On the other hand, the Qumran texts reflect the idea that the prophets have books that need interpretation in order to discover their real hidden meaning, and that the Pesher Habakkuk presents the legendary leading figure of the Qumran community, the so-called teacher of righteousness, as someone qualified to explain things that God had revealed the prophets. Nevertheless, the exact nature of an early interpreter of these texts remain uncertain. At best, we can say that interpretation was assumed not to be accessible for everyone, and some internal knowledge or special skills that were fundamentally God-granted gifts were required to access it. Okay, I will now turn to the Greek texts. The ancient Greek texts bear witness to multiple characters who appear in divinatory roles. In the present analysis, I will focus on only one particular group of diviners, the Chesbologoi, whose task was to interpret already delivered oracles. And if anyone read the abstract of this lecture, there I ambitiously said that I would also talk about the exegetai, but I changed my mind due to my recent visit at the Epigraphic Museum here, where I started to think that maybe the text, these sacred laws that they interpret, it was different type of interpretation, and I didn't see links to a new prophetic or revelatory experience. But maybe some of you know more about this. I would be happy to talk about it. But now I decided to leave that part aside. So the cosmologoi feature prominently in various ancient Greek texts, especially 6th and 5th centuries, and it seems that they were particularly well known in Athens. As mentioned earlier, I do not intend to suggest that the cosmologoi offer a parallel to the Jewish interpreters of the texts. Rather, the point of the comparative reading is to observe the similarities and differences that such a comparison reveals. One famous literary tradition that attests to the function of cosmologoi is the account of the so-called wooden wall preserved in Herodotus' histories. This narrative concerns the time of the Persian Wars and sums up the Athenian preparations for the expected attack, describing how they twice consult the oracle of Delphi. The first response of Pythia is that their city will be destroyed. The Athenians prepare themselves to flee it, but yet just before leaving they decide to consult the oracle for the second time. And then Herodotus writes about the priestess' response at the following events. So the oracle delivered goes as follows: "Yet shall a wood-built wall by Zeus all-seeing be granted unto the Tritoborn, a stronghold for thee and thy children." Sorry, it's a lot of the text. But I will read it so we know what we're talking about. "This being in truth and appearance a more merciful answer than the first." So this is the second oracle. "They wrote it down and departed back to Athens. So when the messengers had left Delphi and laid the oracle before the people, there was much inquiry concerning its meaning, and there were two contrary opinions, in especial among the many that were uttered. Some of the elder men said that the god's answer signified that the Acropolis should be saved, for in old time the Acropolis of Athens had been fenced by a thorn hedge, and by their interpretation it was this fence that was the wooden wall. But others supposed that God signified their ships, and they were doing naught else but equip these. They then that held their ships to be wooden wall were disabled by the two last verses of the priest's answer. Salamis, I'll divine, this with the children of women, thou shalt destroy one day in the season of the seed time or harvest. These verses confounded the opinion of those who said that the ships were the wooden wall. For the readers of oracles, cosmologoi, took the verses to mean that they should offer battle by the senior Salamis and be there overthrown. Several details of this passage ask for some further attention. First of all, the Athenians who consult Pythia had their response written down. Here evidently it's not the Athenians themselves or Pythia or the cosmologoi who memorized the oracle and writing. Rather, it may have been other officials who operated on oracle sites and were responsible for recording the official versions of the oracles. Especially when the inquirers came from far away and had to bring the responses back to their town, it made sense to record it. Therefore, the recording was necessary in order to interpret the oracle later. When Herodotus then later mentions the cosmologoi, it's essential to point out that they were seemingly specialized in interpreting the written rather than the oral oracles. However, it's possible that in this particular narrative, where the first oracle is not referred to as the recorded one, writing contains also a special meaning. Herodotus may have wanted to show in the historical record that the second one was more definite than the first. So even if the usual form of prophecy was oral, at least in some cases the written transcript may have held a special status. Herodotus reports that in Athens a controversy arose over the interpretation, and especially concerning its reference to wooden wall. This was interpreted in different ways. Some claimed that it referred to the survival of Acropolis, which was surrounded by a wooden wall, and others concluded it meant ships. Offering one of the explanations for the oracle, and especially on the last two verses, the Thesmologo explained that if the Athenians prepared to meet the enemy at the sea, they were bound to lose. All in all, writing seems to serve as a guarantee that the oracle was memorized correctly and it had been correctly preserved for later consultation and verification. Apart from providing interpretation for the written oracles of their own time, the Thesmologoi also used the presumably extant oracle collections. These collections are not attributed to the prophets of a specific oracle site, but to the mythic figures who belong to remote past, such as Museus, Orpheus, and Bacchus. Concerning these figures, little more than their names survive, and consequently we do not know anything about their possible lives. Moreover, no obvious copy of their oracle is preserved. Despite these uncertainties related to their investigation, the multiple references to the collections of the oracles are usually taken as a sign that the prophecies were extant and widely circulated in the Greco-Roman period. One well-known literary context where such an earlier collection is referred to is another passage by Herodotus. This concerns a passage where Herodotus now presents the Persian ruler Xerxes in deciding whether or not to send an expedition to Greece, and on this occasion consulting a logo and oracles attributed to Museus. They had come up to Sardis with Onomacritus, an Athenian diviner, Chresmologos, who had set in order the oracles of Museus. They had reconciled their previous hostility with him. Onomacritus had been banished from Athens by Pisistratus' son Hipparchus when he was caught by Lassus of Hermione in the act of interpolating into the writings of Museus an oracle, showing that the island of Lemnos would disappear in the sea. Because of this, Hipparchus banished him, though they had previously been close friends. Now he had arrived at Susa with the Pisistratidae, and whenever he came into the king's presence, they used lofty words concerning him, and he recited from his oracles. All that portended disaster to the Persians he left unspoken, choosing and reciting such prophecies as were most favorable, telling how the Hellespont must be bridged by a man of Persia and describing the expedition. In this passage it appears that Herodotus is well familiar with Onomacritus, the diviner, who specializes in Museus' oracles. According to the passage, Onomacritus is an arranger of the oracles, and Herodotus also knows his reputation for manipulating the oracles, perhaps for his own interest. As Herodotus mentions that his handling of Museus' text had earlier caused a conflict between Onomacritus and Xerxes' courts, it may be that the Chresmologoi were not supposed to change existing oracles. If they did, they were at least sometimes condemned for such free handling of the texts. Yet Onomacritus is now called again for help, and interestingly, Herodotus narrates how he recited from his oracles. Herodotus refers to his use of the oracles with the Greek verb katalego, indicating that Onomacritus was not being depicted as reciting all the oracles he possessed, but rather to have chosen and selected some of them. Herodotus adds that Onomacritus chose in particular those passages that were favorable for the Persians, leaving out those that predicted disaster for them. One characteristic that seems to be relevant when we consider these oracles and their function concerns their primary setting. Unlike oracle sites where the concrete questions were posed in order to find answers to day questions, the function of oracle collection appears to be different. Because of the oracle interpreters were able to use them at various occasions, they seem to have been entirely literary works. It has been proposed that the collections may have contained general predictions of judgment and destruction, and that their overall ambiguity gave room for interpretative expertise of oracle interpreters. Meanwhile, prophetic responses that addressed specific situations, such as the wooden wall oracle, could not have been used at various occasions with as much of flexibility. The narrative on Onomakritus allows us to observe another interesting feature that concerns the practice of interpretation. Namely, this passage reveals that the existing collections allowed the interpreter to select those passages that were the most useful for the present purpose. According to Herodotus, Onomakritus did not systematically read all oracles which were available for him. Rather, he selectively chose those passages that he deemed the most appropriate and fitting for Xerxes. Despite this, the author does not cast Onomakritus in a particular critical light, in contrast to the earlier mention about him manipulating the texts. This seems to imply that such a selective reading was acceptable. Finally, Onomakritus' recitation of oracles turns out to be convincing because the narrative concludes with Xerxes sending an expedition to Greece. All in all, these examples testify to two different types of texts that the Chrysmologoi operated with. They interpreted the oracles that were uttered by prophets of oracle sites, such as Delphi. These written oracles could be direct answers to queries concerning contemporary matters. In such cases, the Chrysmologoi were consulted as to their meaning. Furthermore, they possessed collected oracles that were attributed to mythical characters. They recited from these collections upon request with regard to pressing matters that called for divinely inspired knowledge. So what can we draw from these examples? Jewish and Greek texts that refer to divinatory use of prophetic oracles share, on my view, various features. First of all, both corpora suggest that while the prophets are thought, and now I'm saying this, are thought, especially referring to the Jewish texts where we do not have any primary witness of prophecy ever taking place. So while we think that they mostly operated orally, writing is closely associated with their activities. On the one hand, oracles were memorized in writing in order to bring them to their audiences, and such occasions are frequently reported in both texts. On the other hand, writing may have provided the opportunity for so-called authentication. Prophecies were often future-oriented, and thus it was crucial that they could be examined and verified later on. For these both reasons, it was imperative that the oracles were recorded. In both contexts, such oracle collections are typically attributed to figures we basically know nothing about. Bacchus and Muses are part of the mythic past of the Greeks, and their historicity is highly questionable. The same applies to the Jewish literary prophets, to whom some written and collected oracles are attributed, such as Isaiah, Ezekiel, and so on. These texts preserve only marginal references to the biographies of the figures themselves, and therefore the people credited with having delivered these oracles remain mostly enigmatic. Let us then turn to the interpreters of the texts. The two corpora also share some interesting parallels concerning the use of the presumably pre-existing written oracles. Most importantly, both agree that some of the already existing oracles could be subsequently explained and rendered meaningful for contemporary circumstances. While some of the oracles are strictly relevant only on contemporary matters, other utterances were collected and preserved so that they could be consulted later on. An evident sign of such consultation is attested by the Pesharim that comment composition that were written centuries earlier. Also, Onomakritus interprets oracles that were attributed to mythic figure of the past. The revelations were not thought to go out of the date in some way. In contrast, their ancient provenance may actually have added to their value. Both Jewish and Greek corpora suggest that the interpreters had a certain level of freedom in their use of the texts. Interpreters did not necessarily make use of the entire collections, but focused on selected sections. The interpreter cautiously chose to use the parts that fit the present setting the best. This becomes particularly evident in Onomakritus's reading, but it can also be seen in the Jewish Pesharim, which do not offer a running commentary for the entire corpus of prophetic oracles, but only to the selected verses. Alongside these apparent similarities, our materials also bear some notable disparities. Throughout this paper, I have tried to emphasize that the sources cannot be that the sources that can be used to reconstruct the activities of the ancient interpreters are not fully compatible with each other, and one should be cautious not to force the text from one cultural context to answer the questions of another one. And this concerns in particular the role and status of the interpreter. As noted above, Jewish texts do not provide us with explicit information about the characters who were in charge of the oracles. However, one disparity, on my view, is evident. Jewish texts that make reference to the ancient interpreters of oracles accord them with esteem almost identical to that granted to the prophetic figures themselves. John Barton writes that prophets are, and I quote, are people who are out of ordinary because they have a special relationship with God. On my view, this description seems to fit the later interpreters too. Daniel's wisdom and access to divine knowledge is not self-taught, but it comes from God. Book of Daniel, chapter 1:17 states, "To these 4 young men God gave knowledge and skill in every aspect of literature and wisdom. Daniel also had insight into all visions and dreams." So he could not get this knowledge by learning, but it was a gift. In a similar vein, the author of Pesher Habakkuk writes that God told the teacher of righteousness all the mysterious revelations of the prophets. Meanwhile, the picture that arises from the Greek text is different. Sources show that oracular interpreters were sometimes met with suspicion. With regards to the wooden wall oracle, Herodotus narrates that Klesmologoi expressed just one explanation among many others. Furthermore, Onomakritus, who recited oracles from Xerxes, had earlier earned a questionable reputation. Other texts also attest that Klesmologoi often were met with dubious reception. It may be that the suspicion of this group reflects the gap between the recitation of the oracle and the moment of its interpretation. Klesmologoi did not have the authority that the prophetic sight gave figures such as Delphic Pythia. Moreover, the passages we've explored do not describe them as being in contact with any divine being or in any way inspired. It's possible that Herodotus assumes this to be the case, but however, inasmuch as their contact with the divine being is not spelled out in the texts, the possibility that they operated independently is left open. Hence, the attribution of a text to an established authoritative figure, such as the Delphic Pythia or the mystic Museus, shored up the authority of Klesmologos. In certain respects, the Jewish interpreters of prophetic text operated in ways somewhat similar to the Klesmologoi. However, despite their similarities, there are also differences, and the most notable concerns the status of the interpreters. While in Jewish texts, oracular interpreters are presented as divinely inspired figures themselves, such a feature seems to be lacking in Greek sources. Therefore, the two kinds of interpreters are not fully compatible with each other. This imbalance also draws further attention to the differing nature of the collections. It seems that the Greek texts present various types of interpreters in their narratives, including those that were met with suspicion. In contrast, Jewish texts clearly prefer those that were divinely inspired and somewhat prophetic themselves. Conclusions. When a modern scholar starts to think about the ancient interpretative processes of the oracles, there is a risk at looking at the ancient text through our own modern experiences. We are tempted, or at least I am tempted, to think about modern religious professionals, such as priests and teachers, who read a text and contemplate on given passages, and then draw lessons from them to our own contemporary lives. As we have seen, such an image that derives from our own contemporary era corresponds only in some ways with the ancient material. Therefore, before drawing any further conclusion, a methodological caution should be highlighted. The aim of this study was to provide insight into the shift of divination during the Second Temple era by comparing the Jewish and Greek interpreters of the prophetic oracles. I've aimed at demonstrating that in the ancient Greek context, the texts were used for divinatory purposes already in the 6th century BCE, and I suggest that this evidence should be taken into consideration when we try to complete the fragmentary picture on ancient divinatory use of the Jewish texts. During the post-exilic era, the Jewish composers of the text and their interpreters operated in a shared cultural continuum with the Greek authors. As previous comparative studies on the commentary texts themselves prove, they share various affinities. By a comparative analysis, I've explored some new possible models for how the interpretive figures may have functioned. It was acknowledged that the interpretive methods utilized by these individuals seem similar. However, the striking difference between the interpreters concerned their status. While in the Jewish text the interpreters are prophet-like, divinely selected figures who are granted the correct interpretation by the divine being, the chresmologoi appear to work on their own. They're connected to divine beings via their interpretation of the oracles. Yet whether they were depicted as divinely inspired remains questionable. All in all, the comparison with the Greek cosmologoi does not answer historical questions concerning the existence of such interpretive figures. Rather, it offers at least some new methodological tools and concepts that can be used to think about the first interpreters of the text and their cultural roles. The similarities between the interpreters of written oracles and the prophets that preceded them strengthen the theory that prophecy or revelation could take place through texts. Crucially, when we place the Jewish texts that lack explicit reference to the divinatory use of the text within the common cultural context of ancient Eastern Mediterranean region, it seems logical to assume that at least to a certain extent, the divinatory use of the texts accomplished by the chresmologoi and others would have been familiar in the Jewish communities as well. Thank you very much.